It's good to be here. Thanks for coming on a Sunday lunchtime. To my direct right is Konstantin Gricic, industrial product designer, who needs no more introduction. I know a lot of the faces here, so I know you know Konstantin's work well. And also next along, Martin Boyce, whose work most of you also know. I'm Alex Coles. The reason we're here, or partly the reason we're here, is to launch a book, The Transdisciplinary Studio, which has just come out through Sternberg Press in Berlin. And it is available in all good bookstores for 22 euros, and probably some bad bookstores as well, I guess. I'll just say a little about the framework for the book, just to introduce things, and then Konstantin and Martin are going to talk a little bit about their studios and how their studios developed. So this notion of the transdisciplinary studio, the transdisciplinary has become a concept that is replacing the interdisciplinary. If you think of the interdisciplinary as when we had things like design art, the relationship between design and art, with the transdisciplinary is a kind of stage beyond that, whereby practitioners from across architecture, design, and art are working across those fields within one practice, even if they are mostly thought of as a designer, an artist, or an architect. And what I did was to spend up to 3 months in a series of different studios. For the first volume, the one that's just come out, I spent some time with Oliver Eliasson in Berlin, with Konstantin in Munich, with Jorge Pardo in Mexico, in the Yucatan, and with a graphic design collective in London called Abarki. And what I was trying to do was introduce a new kind of research to writing about art, design, and architecture, what you could call an embedded type of research. And I thought by spending time in each of the studios, observing, interviewing studio assistants and so forth, that I would get closer to the process by which the ideas are generated for the work and the work itself is actually fabricated. My sort of selfish interest was to try and kickstart writing about art, design, and architecture, and write in a way that was much more dynamic and much more engaging. This kind of method's often called the participant observation method, which comes from anthropology, and it's associated with someone who observes the culture around them, but also participates in it to some degree, which is what I did when I spent time in each of the studios. And Martin and I have just started a dialogue which will continue in the second volume, which will come out next year. Now, Konstantin and Martin are just going to say a few sort of general things about their studios, how they've developed, how they use the studio as a tool, and then I'll have some sort of more general points across both of you. Are you okay to?
Shall I start? Yes. I should start at the beginning, and that is 1991, when I finished my studies at the Royal College of Art in London, and set up my own studio relatively directly after finishing my studies. And setting up the studio at that time, this is 20 years ago, it was had no business plan, of course. It was very naive in a way. It was very small scale. if you imagine I was buying the first computer then. There was no internet. There was a fax machine, and telephone was a kind of an infrastructure or facility which was kind of the most important to have. And my first studio was actually renting desk space. That's what it was called. So you share a studio with others, and there was already a telephone line, and there was a fax machine we all shared. And I had a desk, the size 1.50 m by 1 meter, and that was really my space from which everything seemed possible, at least at that very beginning. And it was really nice that things were so simple then. And now, 20 years later, my studio, of course, has become much more complicated with all the facilities, the equipment, with more people, but also in terms of how things work. But the complication is also good, of course. I wanted this. The studio is still relatively small. There's 6 of us altogether, 4 designers, which I employ, 1 personal assistant. We work in one large open plan space in Munich, actually, in the south of Germany, which as a location is relevant for the work we do. We work mainly with clients. That means industrial companies that produce our work. In fact, when I set up my studio 1991, the desk space, I already called myself industrial designer. I was hardly working for industry then, but this is what I wanted to do. And this is what we still do today. However, and this is in a way the topic, of course, of the talk, the studio and what we do from the studio has changed, and it's become much more than industrial design, which is still the core, still takes the core of our time. But other projects have started to develop and evolve. We do exhibition design, designing exhibitions, but also partly curating them, which all started maybe 10, 12 years ago with a company that I work with who asked me to kind of curate their collection and make shows of what they produce. And I enjoyed that, and I've since then made it almost a second part of what we do in the studio, exhibition. But now one of the projects we will be doing from after the summer is working on costumes for a ballet. This is something will be quite new and different. We are involved in design work, which is not necessarily designing products, but it's more to do with going inside companies and understanding how they operate, what it means for them to be producers, to be to do their research, production, even the selling. So I think my studio has changed and evolved in the same way as the whole idea of what a designer is has changed. We are still designers giving form to something, but giving form to something is not necessarily just the physical object, but it's trying to design processes or organizing things and so on.
And there's one thing I wanted to ask you about before we go on to Martin. When I first went to Konstantin's studio a few years ago, I said I'd like to come and talk to you about the studio, and the first thing that you said was, but I don't think of it as a studio, I think of it as an office.
Yes.
Could you say something about that, what that word means for you?
Well, I guess in the same way as I called my little desk Konstantin Gilchrist industrial design from the very beginning. I always liked the idea of an office in a way professionalizing what what it actually was at the time. And I preferred the term office to studio because I think that it also made clear that we are kind of involved with industry and with clients. Even I don't know. It's a very personal thing. I like the idea of the office and of going to the office in the morning, leaving the office in the evening, I think it's really it doesn't. You noticed it, and it was interesting that we then spoke about it. It was something that really was important way back for me, and I still keep it that way. I talk about my office as an office, and that also implies a certain organization of that space, but also of what the everyday life is like. We have very strict office hours. Nobody's allowed to come before 9, and people have to leave by 7, and nobody's allowed to come in on the weekends, and we have there's a lunch break at a set hour.
And a pretzel break.
And a tea break in the morning. So silly things, but somehow I like them that way. This kind of form of structuring creates a lot of freedom within that structure, and this has mattered to me.
Mm-hmm. 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 Martin?
Yeah, it sounds like we have quite a sort of parallel sort of situation. I mean, I graduated my undergraduate in 1990 from Glasgow School of Art. And at that point, you know, like most people, you're sharing a flat with a bunch of other young artists, and so the kitchen table was the studio. I mean, and sometimes you had to take turns. You know, if somebody had a project or something they were working on, it was like they got, you know, the kitchen table for that week. And actually, relatively recently, I did a solo show in New York a couple of years ago, and I was in between studios, and I pretty much produced the show from my kitchen table. Yeah, and in Glasgow, when I graduated, and really for quite a long time, my generation of artists didn't have studios. It was sort of, it wasn't really, it was felt that it was a sort of traditional model that was unnecessary. And we all started traveling quite a lot to make shows, working with young galleries. And so you would use, you know, you'd use your bedroom as the thinking space, and then you would use the gallery as the making space. Because the galleries you were showing with at that time couldn't afford to ship the work, so they would ship you. And, you know, so I started making work that was, you know, came about from that situation. So I would go and make wall paintings. I would go to the local DIY store, buy masking tape and pots of paint, and I'd make a wall painting. And then over time, it became, well, I didn't think I needed a studio. The other thing is I've never looked for and found a studio. Someone's always, it's usually someone in the crowd, who kind of says, here's a room, maybe this could be useful for you. You go, oh yeah, that's a good room. Yeah, how much is it? Yeah, okay. And that's really what's, the 3 studios I've had ever have been pretty much in that, you know, come about in that situation, more or less. And so it's never been about, you know, the ideal studio. You know, I mean, I'm a sculptor primarily. I make things, and I make large-scale installations or arrangements of sculptures. But my studio is on the 3rd floor of a building right in the middle of Glasgow, and the elevator is, you know, this size. So it's not practical in that sort of conventional sense. But I really like it. I really like being there. I like going there. And so there are works that get made there, or aspects of the work get made there. But then I also work very closely with a workshop, with a fabrication company in Glasgow. And increasingly they, you know, it's like an extension of the studio. So I in my studio, I'll, you know, work on prototypes or models, drawings, until until very recently, I hand draw all the technical drawings for for the fabricators on a little drawing board this size that I got for my Christmas when I was about 12, when I wanted to be an architect. And so then I go and I meet with the workshop, and and by this point we've been now working together for 10 years or so, and we really it's a great relationship. We really understand each other. I can be there when I need to be there, and so it's absolutely not a case of there's the drawing and the model, I'll come back when it's finished. It's an ongoing process. So they do the cutting and welding and shaping and of most of the parts, and then I'll come up and then we'll change things. So it's quite live. That we'll actually go, well, actually that's not quite right. Let's cut this off here and we'll move this up here. And let's rust this piece and let's do this. Which means so again, it's like, I sort of occasionally I ask myself, or someone asks me, why don't you have your own workshop with your own people, doing that work? But I guess the reality is, I don't, then you have this pressure of, if you have you employ a welder, you need to find things for him to weld all the time, and like maybe that's not going to be the case.
I mean, that was something that struck me about both of your studios, was the way that you outsourced a lot of things, which was a complete contrast to the two other studios I'd spent time in, to Olafur and Jorge's, whereby everything was embedded in the studio. The ideas were generated in the studio. Things were researched within the studio, and everything's fabricated within the studio. So they both have this immense control over everything, or perhaps just a different type of control because of that proximity. But you've both sort of actively chosen to not embed those things. But is that just for the practical reasons, like you mentioned, or?
But because it's this sort of accumulative effect of how you work, and in some cases you create a situation because this is how you work, and in other cases you work because this is the situation. It's like one thing affects the other, one thing pulls and another pushes, and I kind of don't know whether I work the way I work because that's the situation I'm in, and I could potentially change that, but then I don't see the need to because it's working, So it's like practicality, and also I guess it might be different for you, Constantine, but I mean, being an artist isn't particularly practical. And the process quite often isn't practical on all sorts of levels, economically and kind of, and just as a lifestyle or whatever. It's not, and so you kind of muddle your way through until you find something that seems to work. And it's for me, it seems to be working now,
It's interesting, and because it sounds so familiar, but of course on a different, what you do is so different in the end to what we do as industrial designers. First of all, we really work for clients, so in the end, what we design will be produced at the end very professionally and for sure by someone else. But the development of that work is a process that, of course, we are very involved in, and we somehow choose, of course, how that process is. And what I liked about your description is exactly this: the kind of the two scenarios. One, which is the kind of the limitation, which informs how you work and what you do. And I would say that even the way my office is set up builds in this limitation. I really want such a limitation. For example, the way we make models. Of course, we make models, but I don't have a workshop. I deliberately don't have a workshop And it's like your story with the welder. Even having certain machinery would make me want to use this machinery, and not having the machinery in a way is a limitation, because then we just make things from paper, but at the same time it just makes things much more free. We can do what we want to do. And then the other scenario is the extension of this limitation by involving other people, other outside workshops, having things made by whoever. And for us, of course, this extension, which is also, is not only the facility of making things, but also a kind of, it's also the know-how that you can bring in from outside, which for us, industry means working with engineers, working with people that are very
specialists.
Specialists, and I think I have to be specialist enough to recognize the specialist and to challenge the specialist. But I never want to be the only specialist. Therefore, that would mean the only thing I do is within my specialization. So it's kind of probably not possible to define exactly how it works, but it is moving in between these kind of poles of the constraint and the kind of keeping things very open and also, of course, we change. I mean, I work very different today than I worked 20 years ago or even 3 years ago. But at the same time, it may be that tomorrow I think, wouldn't it be nice to work like 10 years ago? And then that should also be possible.
And one thing that's interesting I saw was, because both Martin and Konstantin outsource fabrication, which obviously Konstantin's case is a necessity when you're dealing with that kind of volume. But because fabrication is outsourced, you both use the maquettes, and particularly you, Konstantin. People that don't know too much about the process by which Konstantin designs, it's very tactile and very much working with materials and shaping a life-size model before the prototype, and also with yourself, but with the maquettes I saw on the last visit were scale.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes the other thing is that as things progress, the things that you used to really enjoy doing, like hand drawing, the technical drawings, you don't have time to do anymore. And one of my favorite things to do is to make these maquettes. And I think I used to make them for a number of reasons, and sometimes it was to have something to do. Yeah. I mean, of course, it was to kind of see or try and understand this form, but it only gives you so much information. It doesn't give you all the information you need. But it was also just the process of something becoming three-dimensional in front of your eyes, and it was just you felt like at the end of the day, you felt like you achieved something. And that happens. That still continues to happen, but I don't meticulously make a maquette for everything I do. It doesn't always work quite like that. I mean, quite often it's a combination of sort of full-size drawings, bits of cardboard and so on, just the usual way of thinking through things.
And what surprised me with last year, Konstantin did maybe your first, I think it was, proper limited edition series with Galerie Créo in Paris. And one thing that surprised me there, it was perhaps one of the few opportunities you had whereby something wasn't going to be mass-produced, and that possibly could have been fabricated, or elements of it fabricated or finished in-house. But again, you chose to work with a specialist lacquerer, someone that had worked on the BMW art cars, the Stella and Warhol and so forth, in the 70s. So that was, I thought, that really surprised me, but in a good way. But
well, this particular project, which is large aluminium tables painted like race cars or sports equipment. It originally was a project I wanted to do for a producer on an industrial scale, because every bicycle frame that you buy is full of paint and graphics and so on, or skis or tennis rackets. This is what I liked, and the inspiration really comes from an industrial product, but the furniture industry, for some reason, wasn't ready for it, or they were scared of it, because furniture never has things written on it. And so, because I was just interested in this project, in the notion of what happens to furniture if we say it is fast. Changes a table to say that it's a fast table. It's ridiculous, but the same actually goes for a pair of skis. It's the same pair of skis if you write, I don't know, racing on it, or you say, I don't know, comfort. But psychologically, of course, something changes, and this is what I was interested in, and the way we were able to realize the project in the end was on that kind of much smaller scale, working with a gallery, which is the kind of experimental space then for such projects, and with craftsmen, with a guy who not only painted the art cars, but he was actually a racing driver, and he came into that whole business from his racing.
I didn't know.
Racing. But now, in retrospect, I think this experience made it so much stronger than had we done this project for industry. The process of developing these graphics, which the project was all about, would have probably been much more synthetic or detached from its making. We would have designed it on the computer. The project, as it turned out, working with the lacquerer, made it so much more kind of immediate and hands-on, even though, of course, we didn't spray it. But and I think that made the project be so much better, and of course it shows that a lot, especially with projects where you go onto new territory, the feedback, the friction, the kind of the analog, or empirical, you make it, and you learning by doing, getting your hands on it matters so much. Nowadays, with a lot of the industrial design, I can probably jump some hurdles in the beginning because some things are repetitive and I've done them before. I know what it means to put two tubes together, but still, in the end, we never design things purely on a computer, sending drawings somewhere and they make it and it would be fine. There's always the kind of there need to be the physical moment of having something there sitting in front of you, made of a material, changing it, and so on.
I think my experience of it wasn't the first time I came in contact with your work, but was the Mito chair, which there's I got really excited about this chair, and it was after reading about the actual material that it was made from. And I phoned up the company and phoned up Planck and said, have you got any information on this chair? The guy was really nice. He sent me the book, and the book really documents the whole process. And it's quite rare to have that insight into one object and how it kind of starts off as bits of cardboard in a studio, and then sort of through the production process. And that was really, it was a real eye-opener, and actually it made me think that in terms of process, it wasn't as mystical. There wasn't this mystery to it that I sort of imagined in this mass-produced world, that the starting point was, folding things and bending things, and I mean, I do it myself. When you do, you think, what height should this be? So you get the nearest thing to hand, you get a bucket, and you sit on it, you go, I think it should be a little bit higher, so you put a book under the bucket, that kind of thing. And I mean, I did that. It's funny you saying you designed costumes for ballet. I've just designed a set for Scottish ballet, and we have to maybe one of the parts is this pillar, And we're in the workshop saying, well, what's the diameter of the pillar? I said, I don't know. So there was a bin, a huge big, another bin, this kind of bin, so we get it over, and I'm looking at it and sort of trying to, you're doing that thing, blocking out the view of it with your finger and sort of imagining it taller, and so you start getting a big tube of paper and trying to, sort of really ad hoc way, trying to work out, and then you go, well, I think it should be about that size,
Yeah. And I've got before we have hopefully some questions from, maybe a more sort of general but sort of strategic question, on a more strategic level. I mean, how do you both feel, I mean, Konstantin's someone that's very highly thought of in the art world and is present in the art world, especially with the Design Real show in 2009 at the Serpentine. And Martin as an artist who works with the vocabulary of design, or sort of past the archive of design vocabulary. I mean, how do you feel? I guess one thing that strikes me from visiting many different studios is that artists like Jorge and Olafur, and not in Martin's case because he works very much on his own, which was a surprise, very sort of intimate, is that artists usually have a group of designers within the studio who are actually doing the literal designing of the things, designing the objects, the spaces, working with the fabricators, or if they're in-house or not. Where designers also have designers working within the studios. I remember Jorge saying that like he would never have an artist work for him in the studio because of the ego kind of frictions there would be. And there's an interview with one of his studio team that was kind of fired because of the friction and then came back, which is quite amusing. That's in the book. But it strikes me that it's, in a way, it's like the rise and the dominance of design throughout, or design processes, design context with the design Miami, next door. It's the dominance of design. I just wondered what you feel about the play between those two contexts.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question that's constantly asked, and I was involved in a symposium in Zurich a couple of years ago, and I mean, nobody came up with a good answer. There's this relationship between design and art, and I think that on one hand, to try and look for that, to try and sort of find a definition point, sort of reduces the possibilities of both. And I think the whole thing about, I can't speak for the process of designing, but the freedom, and I think the relationship is in the imaginative space, is that there's some. I'm really interested in the presence of things, the presence that something will have in a room, that you can alter the atmosphere or the temperature, of a space by, placing something or arrangement of things in the room. I mean, I love the way, just the different possibilities of how the legs on a table can touch the floor, and their relationship with the tabletop. It just doesn't cease to kind of fascinate me and interest me, and I sort of translate some of those feelings that I get into my practice. And for me, it's quite emotional, and it's about feelings and sensations, and that, rather than, I mean, it's, although there's absolute, there's reference points that I maybe kind of veer towards, they're useful for me, and sometimes conceptually useful in terms of some of the potential meaning of the work or reading of the work. But by and large, it's about something else. It's about something sort of it's more difficult to put your finger on. It's about presence.
I wouldn't have an answer but I think, of course, it's also very subjective in the end. What relationship I feel towards I have with the art world. I like it. It's always interested me, even though I always knew that I'm not an artist. I couldn't be an artist. But looking at art, I enjoy it, first of all. I think there's very good art. Even I think there are a lot of artists that are pretty good designers, whereas I think that there are hardly any designers that are good artists. I think art is an inspiration, or inspiration is such a shallow word, but it is a reference for seeing things. And now I'm speaking really about the kind of just the visual, the kind of that rich visual resource and the materials. And I think artists push that much further than we do as designers, because we are certainly in industrial design. We have those constraints, but that doesn't mean that we can't. I think we can change these boundaries, and I don't know. I find a lot of the kind of encouragement or reference in art. I think artists, a lot of them, or anyway the few, have an incredible sense for using space that as designers maybe sometimes we don't have, the kind of how to occupy space. I think there's something I really learned from fine artists, how to deal with space, and it's not architectural. It's of something else, maybe of what you spoke about, this kind of the presence of something, and this the physicality of it.
And maybe just before, hopefully some questions from you. One thing that was nice for me visiting Konstantin, who's a very small office, 5 or 6 people, and Martin on his own some of the time, and then with maybe one assistant, perhaps more before a show, was that there was space for me as a writer to sort of participate. There was a room for me to participate in the studio culture in some way, which was very much a contrast with someone like Olafor's studio, where he had somebody like me, a writer, an academic, actually on the studio payroll, actually embedded in the studio, which was intriguing, but also a kind of shock. But maybe we've got maybe 5 minutes for a few questions.
If there's no question, let me ask a question. Could you help me to understand again your concept of transdisciplinary vis-a-vis interdisciplinary, and I don't know what more disciplinary there is? Would be great.
Yeah, sure. I mean, if you were speaking very roughly.
In a way, I think it's not really something new now. You know, we had artists, designers, like centuries that were working both in fine arts and then. So I wonder if this is now.
Yeah, I mean,
what's your concept?
It's not a suggestion that it's new, but I think that the interdisciplinary has been a term both in theory, say generated by somebody like Barthes in the late 60s, early 70s. The notion that two fields come together to make a third space in some way. I think that's been superseded now by a transdisciplinary situation, whereby in reality, there are actually no hard and fast boundaries between disciplines, and the way those disciplines play out in contexts like a fair, for instance. And I guess the transdisciplinary as a concept is associated with Deleuze and Guattari in the 70s and 80s. So I think that although you're right, when you go back to the Bauhaus or the Soviet constructivists, there was a certain practitioners that were involved in architecture and art and design, that usually they were actually different practitioners within a structure, say like the Bauhaus. It wasn't one unit within that working between those three fields. Whereas I think now, when you think of Olafur or Konstantin or Zaha Hadid or Ai Weiwei or many other people, I think that they are working in this in a transdisciplinary space, which isn't to say that's a good thing or a bad thing. It's more of a descriptive term.
How do you handle with the concept of authorship when so many people are involved in your work?
I mean, well, yeah. I mean, for me, it's very straightforward. It's mine. It's all mine. No, it's. Well, yeah, but when I talk about the work in a public way, I do occasionally or quite often find myself referring to we, because I'm very aware, and it's not to say that it's a collaborative process as such, but when you do require other people to help the work kind of exist in the world, then those people are incredibly important, and their observations and expertise is hugely valuable. But of course, the work just wouldn't exist without me. I mean, it's something I don't think a great deal about. It's what I do. I make work, and so it's mine. It has my name underneath it when it's the picture. That's really not a very good answer.
Sorry, if I could just jump in. When I was interviewing some of the different studio assistants, one of Jorge's studio assistants moves between LA and Mexico. I asked that same question. How do you feel, or how do you know when you're designing something that you are authoring for Jorge correctly in a way that he would want that done? And I was asking a question along those lines, and she said, do you mean how do I dilute my sense of self? And I thought that was really not sad, but very kind of indicative. By contrast, at Konstantin's studio, I was speaking at length with Olivia, one of your designers, and she made a really good point. She said, once you get to the stage where you're designing for a designer, where it becomes too limited, there's too many limitations, and you find yourself wanting to really diverge with the direction they're taking a design in, then you need to set up your own. You need to set up your own studio, and I thought that they were two, but yeah.
I mean, just to answer my particular case, or that's representative, I think, for design. Of course, I would say in the same way as Martin says, it's I'm the author. The product has my name written on it, but my name actually stands for an office. And on my website, for example, I always list the name of the assistant who I work with for every product. Doesn't mean that we are equal co-authors, but I think the assistants, and maybe we haven't spoken enough about this system, the assistants is very important. There's the assistants, my assistant within the studio, and then of course there's the company, and in my case, of course, there's an authorship also, the producer. So there would be a company called Vitra with Charles Eames or Charles Eames with Vitra, whatever, and it's like that. So there's an authorship. The idea, I think, I have the authorship of the idea, and then the whole process, and in a way, in the end, the manufacturer has another authorship, and that's clearly defined in the design world.
And I guess with art, I mean, in a way, it doesn't surprise me that you say, because it.
Well, at the end of
art relies for its I don't know, for its weight, and I guess for its market value. Art relies on the fact that that's
there is an authorship.
Yeah.
Well, I think my model of, but from my perspective, it's relatively traditional.
Yeah.
You know, it's I'm not.
Yeah.
The model that I have as a kind of as a maker or a producer of art isn't. I'm not attempting to challenge anything within that. You know, hopefully the work itself. You know, there'll be times when it creates a tension. You know, with what's around it, but certainly, it's pretty straightforward. You know.
Is there time for one last question? No, we're going to end there. Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Constantine.